Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 78, Captain James Hill. Captain James Hill was born James Merton on the 20th of November 1831 at Constantine, Cornwall, to Oliver Merton and Mary Ann Hill. He emigrated to New South Wales in the early 1850s and worked on the Hunter River based at Morpeth. He married Mary Doonan at West Maitland on the 4th of September 1854. They had a son, William James Hill, on the 4th of June 1856 at East Maitland. And then George H. Hill was born in Maitland in 1857 but died in 1858. And then another son, Edward Hill, was born in 1860. I cannot find any further records on the son, Edward Hill, other than his birth record. There was also another son, George O. Hill, that was born in and died in 1862. James deserted this marriage in 1862 and took his eldest son, William James Hill, with him. He subsequently remarried bigamously as James Merton to Mary Grace Dalling on the 21st of August 1863 at Hotham, Victoria. And by 1865, John commenced his boat operations on the Murray River in Echuca. They had a daughter, Grace Ethel Hill, in Echuca in about 1865, and Grace died in Echuca in 1877, aged 11. There's a small death notice. Grace Ethel Hill, the only daughter of Captain James Hill of the government snagging boat Melbourne, aged 12 years, deeply regretted by all who knew her. In the year Grace was born, and the year that we assume that James Hill came to Echuca in 1865, his first wife advertised that she was planning to remarry. So this was in the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser on the 27th of April 1865. This is to give notice that my husband, James Hill, who left me 3 years since, does not return to live with me. Within 3 months from this date, I intend to get married again. Mary Hill, Maitland. So in order to remarry, she needed to prove to the courts that she had been deserted for 3 years or more. So she was seeking information to verify, A, whether James Hill was still alive, and B, so he could declare in court that he had deserted her. Not sure whether he responded to this at all, but after this, James Hill reverted to the use of the name James Merton Hill. So he's gone from James Hill, then called himself James Merton in the marriage certificate to his second wife, and now he's calling himself James Merton Hill. On the 10th of April 1872, there was a mention in the article, gold has been discovered at Mount Hope, also in the gullies in the back of Rochester. Gold has also been taken out of the Murray River near Alupna Creek, distant about 54 miles from Echuca upstream, by Captain Hill of the steam snag boat Melbourne. So a snag boat was, as the name suggests, a boat that was designed to go through and remove the snags from the river to make the passage more easier for paddleboat steamers. So seems like Captain Hill was getting some gold on the side. On the 19th of February 1873, snagging operations under the direction of Mr. Shelley will be immediately recommenced by the steamer Melbourne on the Lower Murray. On Monday, Captain Hill started downstream with all his appliances and will probably next be heard of as doing good service in the cause of river navigation in the neighbourhood of Tooleybuck or the Bitchin Pups. So both areas of the Murray River north of Swan Hill. A few weeks later, Captain Hill with the steamer Melbourne and the snagging boat Wardle passed here on the 25th. Captain Hill reports one of the most severe storms he's ever experienced on the river while in the neighbourhood of Pental Island. One enormous tree fell nearly across the steamer, and that's quite close to Swan Hill. And in September 1874, an article, Narrow Escape from Drowning. On Sunday week last at 1 a.m, an old man named McIntyre, cook on the government snag boat Melbourne, very narrowly escaped a watery grave. From a report kindly furnished by a correspondent, it appears that the Pride of the Murray had put ashore alongside of the Melbourne to take up the superintendent of the Victorian snagging party to Echuca. During the time the superintendent was preparing for the journey, McIntyre, who had some little business to transact, was about to go on board the Pride of the Murray when the reflection of the lights deceived him as to the distance of the two boats and how far apart they were, and he stopped overboard. Not being able to swim, and there being a strong upcurrent in the bend at which he entered, he was rapidly carried away. Upon hearing the splash in the water, Captain Hill of the Melbourne immediately ran on deck and called out to some others about, at the same throwing himself down on the guards in the hope of reaching the unfortunate man. Failing in this, and as the man was drifting away, Mr. Hill struck out and succeeded in catching him by the hair of the head and made for the Melbourne, but in the endeavour to catch hold of the guard, he lost his grasp and the unfortunate man again disappeared. At that moment, Mr. Hill felt quite overcome when fortunately the engineer came to his assistance, and just as Mr. Hill was being raised on board, the man who had then gone to rescue McIntyre was heard to exclaim, "I've got him," and both were safely landed, poor McIntyre being very weak after the struggle. In March 1875, snagging operations. For the last week, the snagging steamer Melbourne, under the charge of Captain Hill, has been employed removing a large collection of snags and dead timber, which for such a length of time obstructed the traffic of the river at the point opposite the railway wharf. In the course of a few days, the whole of the work will be completed, including the removal of a portion of the bank of the river at this particular point, so as to render the navigation of the river easier. The necessity of continuing the operations of the snagging party at the present time is shown by the fact that just immediately above the point referred to there is a sandbar, which in consequence of the low state of the river at present is daily increasing in size, so as to cause obstruction to become so great that all traffic will be stopped in a few weeks until the river rises. 2 years later, a preliminary notice, Mr. James Shackle has received instructions from Captain Hill of the government snagging party to offer by public auction on the premises Watson Street at an early date, due notice of which will be given, the whole of his superior and well-kept household furniture and effects, including chairs, tables, bedsteads and bedding, superior drawing room suite, sofas, Brussels carpets, dragating maps, splendid tricord pianoforte, glassware, crockery and kitchen utensils without reserve. So it seems like he's selling up, and it must be at this time that the family moved to Seymour. A year later, the task of raising the barge Murrumbidgee, which sank a short time back about 70 miles below Wentworth, was one of no slight difficulty, and Captain Hill of the steamer Melbourne and the diver who assisted him are entitled to commendation for the successful result of their exertions. So not only is he using his boat for snagging, he's also employed to assist any kind of boats that have been left aground. A couple of months later, in June 1878, on Tuesday morning, the members and officers of the Shire Council, who were on their way at Shepparton, were kindly brought down from Mooroopna by Captain Hill in the snagging boat Melbourne. In September 1878, the Upper Goulburn, the snagging boat Melbourne, has been floated, very little damage being done to her. Captain Hill expects to resume operations in a few days. And in November, navigation of the Upper Goulburn, a letter has been received by an Echuca resident from Captain Hill of the snagging steamer Melbourne, which is at present engaged in the Upper Goulburn. The letter is dated from Seymour on the 18th of November, and Captain Hill says, "The river is very low here. We are doing good work, and although it is only a month tomorrow since we commenced, we have cleared 5 miles of the worst portion of the river. Some of the passages we have cleared have never been navigated until the Melbourne went through. The snags in this part of the river are very large. Logs of 18 to 20 feet girth are anything but uncommon. We expect to get through a lot of work this summer if we are not left high and dry by the water receding. The current is very strong to contend against, running about 5 miles an hour. The Seymour people thought that the clearing of the river was completely frustrated when the Melbourne foundered. We had to raise the vessel by the aid of bullock teams, and since then I have floated the barge of the Bunyip steamer, which sank with a full load of wheat." So it was nothing until 4 years later where it mentions on the 14th of February 1882 the 3 homes owned by Captain Hill were burnt down in Watson Street, Echuca, facing the Murray River, just down from the port of Echuca. They were insured. 7 houses in total were destroyed. And on the 20th of September 1882, it mentions Gospel Temperance Blue Ribbon Army meeting tonight at the headquarters in Hume Street, Echuca, military drill enlisting recruits. A reading by Captain Hill. And then 4 years later, a strange charge of larceny. The Murchison correspondent of The Age telegraphed on Thursday the following: "Great surprise was expressed here today when it became known that Captain Hill of the snagging boat Melbourne had been arrested on a warrant by the local police on a charge of larceny of money and clothing, the property of Peter Davis, the cook of the boat. Money amounting to £5 in commercial banknotes is alleged to have been found by Senior Constable Gannon concealed in Captain Hill's bed, and a flannel shirt worn by the captain at the time of his arrest has also been claimed as the property of Davis. Davis frequently made complaints of losing money and states that within 2 years he had £90 in all stolen from him. Great interest will be taken in the case when it comes on for hearing. We may remark that Captain Hill is well known in Echuca, and the rumour of what has happened when it spreads here yesterday will create intense astonishment." So 3 weeks later in the Seymour Express, Captain Hill's case. The charge against James Hill, master of the steamer Melbourne, of stealing 5 £1 notes and a flannel shirt, the property of Peter Davis, a coloured man, cook and providore on board the Melbourne, was heard by Mr Wyatt PM at Murchison last week. Detective Duncan, prosecutor for the Crown. The prisoner was defended by Mr Gillett of Melbourne and Mr Barthorpe of Murchison. Peter Davis deposed: "I'm employed on the boat Melbourne as a cook. I know the prisoner. He is captain of the Melbourne. I have been employed on board for about 17 or 18 months. The prisoner has been on board all that time. I know Mr Salis, butcher of Murchison. I remember the 13th of March. I am in the habit of dealing with Mr Salis for meat. On the 13th of March, Mr Salis came to the boat and I asked him to take the numbers of 5 £1 notes for me, and in my presence he took the numbers of the notes. I saw the numbers he put down were right. He then handed me the notes and a piece of paper with the numbers of the notes on. I wrapped them up in a piece of paper, a handbill, and put the piece containing the notes on one of the shelves in my galley behind the crockery. I missed the notes with the piece of paper on the 22nd of March. I thereupon communicated with the police. I was present when the prisoner was arrested. The police went into the prisoner's cabin. I was called and the police asked me if the notes that they had found were mine. I replied yes, and it was the same piece of paper I rolled the notes up in. I also saw the flannel on Captain Hill, which I claim as mine, having missed some 10 weeks ago. I claim it as mine because I could swear to the buttons which I sewed on myself, but the prisoner had repaired it." Mr Duncan asked, "What did the prisoner say when you claimed the flannel?" He said, "Are you taking the flannel off my back?" And I replied, "I would take it off the governor's back if it was mine." The prisoner said nothing to this. Then Mr Duncan asked, "What did you do with the piece of paper with the numbers of the notes on?" He said, "I put it in my pocket and handed it to the police when I missed the money. I never saw the notes afterwards until the police showed them to me. The notes were missed on the 22nd of March. I was on shore on that date, about 1 or 2 o'clock to cut wood. I went on board again about 3 or 4. I went on shore again the same day at about 6 p.m. to get some wood, and coming back I saw the prisoner coming out of my galley with his hand in his bosom. I searched the galley and missed the notes. The next morning I gave information to the police, and on the following day the police came. I laid the information and obtained a warrant in consequence of the prisoner being arrested the next day. I will swear that the flannel was mine. The sleeves have been both cut off, the buttons have been cut off and sewn on again with cotton. I've been in the captain's cabin once a month. I was often in the cabin when I used to cook for him. The numbers of the notes were taken on a Tuesday and the captain was arrested on the Thursday. The latest time on the Monday that they could have been taken was 5 or 6 p.m. I used to cook for Mr Hill and he dispensed with my service on account of my bad cooking and dirty ways. The only man I showed the numbers and the notes to was a man, Morrison, employed on the boat. Captain Hill said to me, "You old villain, you put the money under my bed or you had a hand in it." A. Salis, butcher, Murchison, gave evidence of taking the numbers of 5 £1 notes for Peter Davis. Constable Gannon deposed in consequence of a complaint laid, he went down to North Murchison to the steamer Melbourne. He saw the prisoner on the back carrying on the work of snagging. I asked him if I could speak to him in his cabin, and he said certainly and came at once. The witness said information had been laid against him by the cook for stealing 5 £1 notes and asked the prisoner if he had any money, to which he replied, yes, £7. He handed over his purse, which contained one £5 note, 20 shillings in gold and 9 pence in silver. The prisoner said it's a good job, it's a £5 note, or the cook might say it was his. The witness then gave evidence to finding missing notes under the mattress of the prisoner's bed, to the identification by Davis, and to the prosecutor claiming his flannel shirt. I had a warrant for the prisoner's arrest before notes were found. The prisoner said the flannel was made by his wife and given to him on the Sunday. Constable Slattery also gave evidence to the finding of the notes and arresting of the prisoner. Captain Hill went out during the time we were searching and was carrying on his work. I called the prisoner in again and said that he'd better stay during the search. Mr. Gillett addressed the bench at some length, saying that there was no evidence that had been given to show that others besides the captain had not had access to the captain's cabin in the bed in which the money was found by police, pointing out how absurd it would be for a man in the prisoner's position to take a paltry £5 and how unlikely it would be, supposing he did take it, that he would put it in his bed wrapped up in the same piece of paper. He pointed out that there was no case to go to jury. Mr. White remarked that the case against the accused was very weak and that there was no cause for a jury, and his worship dismissed the charge. The court was crowded during the hearing of the case, very great interest being taken in the proceedings. And another article related to the case, a case heard at Murchison a few days ago, which shows the necessity for extreme caution on part of the justices of the peace before granting warrants on the unsupported testimony of any person. At the local police court, Mr. J. Hill, master of the Melbourne snagging boat, appeared on a warrant charged with stealing 5 £1 notes and a flannel shirt. Captain Hill now occupies the position of an innocent man who underwent the ignominy of being placed in a criminal dock on what must be looked upon as a groundless charge. As we said before, the case should be a warning to magistrates to be careful before assisting in blasting the reputation of an innocent person. So by August 1886, in Echuca, arrival of a snagging boat. The snagging boat Melbourne, under the command of Captain Hill, arrived from the Goulburn River yesterday. So James Hill had been over in the Goulburn for quite a number of months doing that work. On Saturday, the 25th of September, in the Riverine Herald, the snagging boat Melbourne. Sometime since we notified the arrival of the snagging boat Melbourne under the command of Captain Hill, and that she was having a thorough overhaul. After having her hull examined and attended to on the slip, she was removed to Rotten Row near the park, where the rest of the requirements were looked after. After this being completed, the steamer got up and the vessel was taken to the opposing bank of the river. The Melbourne draws no less than 4 feet of water. Thus, her guard bores are only a foot above the level of the water, and as frequently as in the course of her work, she's met with stormy weather and obstructions in the shape of snags, and has not been found sufficient to prevent the water from breaking on board in rather large volumes. To prevent this as much as possible, Captain Hill has had a new coaming put all round, which, while adding materially to the appearance of the boat, has had the desired effect. The after cabin is fitted up with a sleeping room for the men. Instead of bunks, there are hammocks. There are tables, a small bookcase, and other sundries suited to the comfort and convenience of all of the men, all being extremely neat and clean. Adjoining to the gallery are the necessary appliances and a large stove, everything being kept in first-class order. Forward from this is what may be termed as a dining room, the decks being movable. Here are the winches by which the snagging operations are carried on all round, and the appliances and running and winding gear. All these, may be remarked, are made on board, and right well they are turned out. At the bow is the forecabin, fitted with lockers and the requisites of the first officer's cabin. The walls, as we might term them, are decorated with paintings, mostly related to the sea, all executed with considerable skill by Captain Hill with the rawest of raw materials. On the upper deck is the captain's cabin, a neat, cosy and very commodious structure, decorated with numerous oil paintings by the same artist. There is a view of the Clipton suspension bridge, a troop ship entering the Dardanelles, and some large men of war paintings. There's a small library of books and every kind of useful furniture required to make the occupant comfortable. Adjoining this is the wheelhouse, and the visitor would be in some doubt on entering as to whether he was on board a ship or in a conservatory. Plants and flowers are growing all around. daphnes, fuchsias, pelargoniums, ivy, and many other kinds in rich profusion, showing the taste and refinement of the cultivator, and spread all around the upper deck are boxes containing plants which are in first-class order and condition and show the care and execution bestowed on them. To look at the Melbourne from this side of the river, one would imagine that she was a new boat, just turned out from the builders' yards, whereas she has been for 21 years engaged in snagging operations and in the company of the Wardle and Fraser, successfully cleared the Goulburn as far as Seymour and a large part of the Murray. During the last 8 years, she has been engaged on the Goulburn, which she has cleared of snags and the dangerous reefs of rocks that exist near Seymour. At the earnest representation of the members for this district, she has now been assigned to Echuca to work solely on the Murray, downstream from Echuca, and at present the river is very high. It is the intention of Captain Hill to take down all the trees on the banks which overhang and are likely to fall into the river. Having cleared the threatening obstructions near the present locality, Captain Hill will work his way down till the water is low enough to commence snagging operations proper. But even here his operations will be somewhat slowed owing to the deep draft of the Melbourne, requiring such a depth of water to work in. In the meantime, however, good work will be done and many logs and obstructions will exist in the neighbourhood and will be removed as speedily as possible. So in June 1887, nearly a year later, snagging operations. The steamer Melbourne, under the command of Captain Hill, arrived in the port yesterday morning for the purpose of taking in 12 months' supplies prior to commencing snagging operations on the Murray between the junction of Moira Lakes and Yalima, where part of the river has been the subject of many complaints over the years. The river is rather high for the removal of snags underwater, but there are many miles covered with dangerously overhanging trees, which will be removed during the high water period, and when the river begins to approach summer level, the work of removing the sunken snags will be commenced. This is a work of our local member, Mr. Shackle MP, urged upon the department early in the present month. The masters of the sawmill fleet of steamers and barges speak very highly of the work done by Captain Hill between the confluence of the Goulburn with the Murray and the Moira Lakes, which has been rendered navigable during the low water periods. It must be gratifying to Captain Hill to know that the rivermen speak in terms of praise of his good results within the last 8 months, during which time some 4 miles of the river was thoroughly cleared. Captain Hill has been engaged in snagging the rivers for 20 years, during which time he has given satisfaction. There is one stretch of river which should be attended to as soon as the boat has finished up at Yalima, and that is between Echuca and the Goulburn. Along these few miles, thousands of trees overhang the river, many of them only held up by the roots, and these will in a short time fall into the stream and obstruct navigation. An immense quantity of sunken snags also exist along the river, and these should be removed. When the work is done, there will be little cause for complaints regarding the upper portions of the Murray for a few years to come. Very often excursion steamers carrying 300 to 400 people run up from Echuca above the Goulburn Junction on the low water, and on more than one occasion excursionists have realised the vessel touching snags which causes them to roll dangerously. And a few months later, in the September of 1887, Captain Hill of Seymour, who accompanied by his wife and daughter whilst out driving on the Goulburn River, met with an accident which fortunately proved not to be of serious nature. It appears that when Mr. Hill was about 2 miles from Tallarook, on his road homeward, one of the horses became restive and got his leg over the pole, which caused the animal to become still more unmanageable, and both horses bolted. They had not gone far before the buggy had capsized, throwing the occupants on the road. Mr. Hill sustained a few slight injuries, while Mrs. Hill and daughter escaped unhurt. The horses were still yoked and were stopped at Tallarook, both animals being uninjured. And on the 25th of January 1889, it's only a month after he completed those Goulburn operations, there was a death notice for his wife. Hill at her residence, Goulburn Villa, Seymour, 24th of January. Mary Grace, beloved wife of Captain James Hill, aged 68 years, second daughter of Captain Delling, Bedford, Devon, England. In the funeral notice, the friends of Captain James Hill are respectfully invited to follow the remains of his late wife to the Echuca Cemetery. And a small notice, we regret very much to have to record the death of the wife of Captain Hill of Seymour, which melancholy event occurred yesterday after a long and painful illness. The deceased lady having expressed a desire to be buried beside her daughter, the remains will be taken by train to Echuca this evening. 2 months after, a notice, board and residence given to a respectable person in business in return for companionship to a young lady. Apply Goulburn Villa, Seymour, James Hill. He's back at work at this time, snagging the Murray. The river being at present time lower than it has been for years, a splendid opportunity is afforded for snagging operations. Captain Hill of the Melbourne is now removing some nasty snags near the junction of the Campaspe and Murray. He also received instructions some time back to clear the Murrumbidgee Reef, a very necessary thing for the safe navigation of the river when low. This, we are informed, can easily be done now that the river is so low. Under these circumstances, we very much regret to learn that Captain Hill has received orders at once to take his snagging boat to Tocumwal, then to Yarrawonga and to the Ovens Junction. First, the very necessary work is not yet done here, and second, why waste time in trying to get to a place where there is not water to carry the boat? In fact, it is an utter impossibility to comply with the order, although we believe the captain will have to start, which will be a great pity unless the order is countermanded. Cannot our mayor or town clerk, who are now in Melbourne, interview Mr Gillies or Mr Steele, the Inspector General of Public Works, and try and get this important matter attended to? So it says, with this view, the snagging boat Melbourne, Captain Hill, has been stationed here and commenced operations last week. All along the course of the stream, from the bridge to the wharf, there is a complete network of snags, the majority of which is just below in the shallow water. Some of these have been gotten out and placed high up on the bank, but others seem to be interlocked and have probably been there for centuries and as a consequence are more difficult to move, let alone clear out of the way. So tenacious are some of these that the strong chains used in the process have snapped and are unable to stand the immense strain. On Saturday, the Melbourne was placed about a couple of 100 yards north of the wharf, where Captain Hill pointed out that in order to clear a good channel for steamers, it will be necessary to cut through the sandbank or reef which crossed the river at that point of the bend, and it can only be effected by proper machinery. It mentions a month later that the snagging of the Murray, the snagging steamer Melbourne under the command of Captain Hill, is now hard at work at the bend of the river immediately below the pavilion in the park. And by the May, the work allotted to the snagging boat Melbourne has been completed before the river rose too high. Captain Hill's been engaged during the last few days in burning off the heaps of small wood left on the banks. So it sounds like the efforts that they had in reversing the decision to go to the Ovens worked, and he was able to stay in Echuca and complete that work. And at this time, he married again. After his second wife's death, he remarried for the third time, using the name James Hill, to Frances Maria Bunker on the 21st of June 1889 at Hare Street, Echuca, and they had 5 children. He is recorded with snagging on January 1890, so 7 months after his marriage. An accident while snagging. A serious accident has occurred to a man named Antony, who was engaged with Captain Hill and the snagging party connected with the steamer Melbourne near Tocumwal. From what we can gather, the injured man and 2 others were engaged in fixing the hauling gear to a tree which was overhanging the river, when suddenly the tree fell, the branches crushing Antony into the river near the water's edge and causing serious injuries to his body and legs. The poor fellow was taken to Cobram to see a doctor, who advised immediate removal to a hospital, and he has probably been admitted to the Mooroopna Hospital. So not long after these operations, Captain Hill moved to Hornsby in New South Wales and retired, and he died on the 20th of October 1919 at his home, Falmouth, in Peats Ferry Road, Hornsby. His wife Frances went on to marry Henry Harrington Irvine in 1921, and she died in Epping, New South Wales in 1957, aged 93. All up, Captain Hill had 10 children to his 3 wives and also 1 adopted child. Of the 10 children, 5 survived into adulthood. And an obituary on Captain James Hill. Widespread regret is expressed at the passing of a grand old man in the person of Captain James Hill, who died at his residence, Falmouth, Peats Ferry Road, Hornsby, on Monday. The deceased was born at Penzance, Cornwall, England in 1830. He was a master mariner by occupation and saw service in the Royal Navy, but for many years has been retired on a pension. He came to Australia in 1873. The late Captain Hill was a man of striking personality and was most high esteemed by all who knew him. In late years, he devoted his time to spiritual work amongst the soldiers. amongst whom he distributed thousands of testaments, and the many expressions of sympathy from soldiers all over the state show the extent to which his few comforting words during the dark days of the war were appreciated. A widow and 4 daughters and 1 son survived the deceased, a son being Lieutenant A.H. Hill MC. The funeral was largely attended and the remains were laid to rest in the Methodist portion of the Gore Hill Cemetery. So Captain James Hill's children. The firstborn, William James Hill, was born in 1856 in East Maitland, New South Wales. William married Annie Agnes Fleury. She'd been born in England and emigrated with her family when she was 4. And the marriage record says, on the 5th of February 1880 at St Francis's, William Hill, only son of Captain James Hill of the steamer Melbourne, to Annie Agnes Fleury, 5th daughter of the late James Fleury, architect Kilmore. They recorded as being in Seymour on the 19th of August 1887, and it says Mr Fuller applied for a protection order for Mrs W Hill under the matrimonial and marriage statute. Mrs Hill examined deposed that she was the wife of William Hill, late of Seymour. They had 4 children and her husband left her on the 4th of July and said that Seymour won't ever see his face again. He did not leave her with consent. And I'm unable to track the whereabouts of William from this point. There is a record of Annie's death in 1909. A woman's dead body, Melbourne. The body of Mrs Annie Hill, 59, a resident of Clifton, was today found in the Yarra, Dights Falls in Collingwood, and it was thought to be a case of suicide. The deceased was stated to have suffered from nervous trouble. She was missed from her home early this morning. And a bit more detail on that, a woman's death. The coroner held an investigation today concerning the death of Mrs Annie Hill. Evidence was given that the deceased had been suffering for some time past with insomnia. She had been treated at St Vincent's Hospital and had been very melancholy. She had been separated from her husband for over 20 years. The autopsy showed the death was due to asphyxia by drowning, and they returned a verdict that the deceased was found drowned in the Yarra, but there was not sufficient evidence to show how she got in the water. The evidence also outlined how she lived in Clifton Hill with her son-in-law, James McInnery, in Morgus Street, Abbotsford, and her daughter Margaret was married to James McInnery. She went to bed on the Monday night in usual health at about 10 o'clock. Mrs McInnery missed her at 7 o'clock yesterday morning, and her husband, after informing the Collingwood police, walked along the banks of the river and found the body of Mrs Hill floating near the falls. He dragged the body out of the water and found life extinct. The deceased had been living with Mr McInnery for about 2 years. So now James and Francis's children. The first child, Albert Harold Hill, was born in August 1888 in Ballarat. He married May Beatrice Robbins. He enlisted in World War I on the 30th of June 1915 in Brisbane and stated his occupation at the time of enlistment as a farmer. He rose to the rank of lieutenant and received the Military Cross and Bar. He was badly wounded in the chest in 1918 and left England to return to Australia in March 1919. He then also enlisted in World War II and was a sergeant on garrison duty in Newcastle, New South Wales in his early 50s. And he died in December 1974 at Binnaway, New South Wales. They had 1 son, Francis. Their second child, Ethel Frances Grace Hill, known as Queenie, was born at Riversdale, Cobram, on the 24th of April 1890. She married Sydney Rupert Patrick in 1913 in Chatswood, New South Wales, and she died on the 3rd of August 1969 in Sydney, aged 79. Lillian Mayhill was born on the 28th of May 1891 at Yarrawonga. She married Reuben Mark Totenhofer in 1914 in Chatswood, Sydney. Reuben was a missionary and they served at Mona Mona Mission at Cairns in the mid-1920s. In 1943, Reuben was a sawyer and they were living at Dundas, New South Wales. They had 6 children. Lillian died in Ryde, New South Wales in 1944, aged 53. The fourth child, Evelyn Daisy Hill, was born at Ballerine, Victoria on the 31st of July 1892. She married William Henry Percival Macpherson in Hornsby, New South Wales on the 17th of March 1915. William was an accountant and they had 4 sons. Evelyn died at Waitara, New South Wales in 1973, aged 80. And as mentioned earlier, James Hill adopted a child as well. This adopted daughter was Mary Ann Teresa Farrier. Mary was born at Donnybrook, Victoria in 1866. Mary's mother was Mary Eliza Whibley, and she was born in Kent, England, and arrived in Tasmania as a free settler in December 1860. She listed her occupation as a housemaid. She married Samuel Edwin Farrier, who is Mary's father. At St James's Cathedral in Melbourne in 1864, Samuel Farrier was a ship's carpenter, and he was born in London in 1822 and served on the Daphne in 1850. They had 4 children. Eldest was Mary, and she was in the Emerald Hill Orphan Asylum when she was adopted by Mary Grace Delling and John Merton in 1874 when she was 8. And it outlines Mary's marriage on the 17th of March 1891. An interesting ceremony took place at the Wesleyan Church, Seymour, on Wednesday, the occasion being the wedding of Miss Annie Farrier, daughter of the late Captain Farrier of Sydney, and for many years the adopted daughter of Captain Hill of Goulburn Villa, Seymour, to Robert Woolley, son of Mr. John Woolley of Suffolk, England. The Reverend Mr. Tregore performed the ceremony, and the building was beautifully decorated for the occasion by the teachers and scholars of the church. The bride, who was prettily attired in a slate-coloured silk dress with a wreath of orange blossoms and tulle veil, looked very well and was led to the altar by Captain Hill. As a token of esteem in which Miss Farrier was held by the teachers and scholars of the Wesleyan Church Sunday School, she was, on Monday evening last, presented with a very handsome silver-mounted biscuit barrel. So Robert was 27 and Annie 25 when they married, and Robert was a plate layer on the railways and Annie a dressmaker at the time of their marriage. Annie died on the 9th of July 1956 in Melbourne, aged 91. She left all the proceeds of her will to the son of her best friend. It says, "This is the last will and testament of Mary Annie Teresa Woolley. I give, devise and bequeath the whole of my estate, both real and personal, to Alan Franklin, son of my friend Florence Emily Franklin, deceased, and James Franklin of Keith Street, Elphington, absolutely." So Annie and her husband didn't have any children. Why was only Annie adopted out of the 4 children? Well, Isabella Jane Farrier was born in 1868 in Hay, New South Wales, and she was admitted to Emerald Hill Orphan Asylum as well on the 22nd of July 1874. However, she died of acute pleurisy hydrothorax on the 21st of December 1875, so a form of pneumonia, I would assume, aged only 7. Their 3rd child, Eleanor Annie Farrier, who was born in Echuca in April 1871, died in October 1872 of meningitis. And the 4th child, Frederick Edwin Farrier, was born on the 1st of November 1873 at Echuca. He died of muscular atrophy on the 12th of November. And then Mary, the mother, died due to a milk fever a day after Frederick's death. Then the father Samuel died the next day on the 14th of November 1873 in Echuca of debility and exhaustion. An inquest was held into his death and the verdict was visitation of God. So in the Riverine Herald in November 1873, it outlined the inquest. On Saturday last at 10 a.m. at the Bridge Hotel, Mr. Langford Coroner held an inquest touching the sudden death of Samuel Farrier. The jury viewed the body, and Mr. Albert Blinshalls Boyd, manager of the Echuca branch of the Bank of Victoria, deposed as follows. "I've seen the body of the deceased and identified of that as Samuel Farrier. The deceased was in my employment. I last saw him alive about 5 p.m. on Thursday on the back veranda. He was then engaged in attending to the bank, cleaning it and so on. I did not speak to him, but went in another direction to avoid conversations with him upon the loss of his wife. The deceased appeared bowed down with grief. On Friday morning about 10:30, I was going through the upper rooms of the bank with Mr. W. Moore, builder, and a painter named Mark Scotlip, measuring for papering and painting, when we came upon the body in a bedroom occupied by Mr. Everest Teller. The deceased was lying on his stomach on the floor with his head a little to one side. I thought at first the man was overcome, but then I noticed he was black in the face and I immediately sent for a doctor. When the doctor arrived, he pronounced the man to be dead. I've known the deceased as a steady man for 3 months. He never threatened suicide that I am aware of." William Rogers Tinsmith deposed that I last saw the deceased between 6 and 7 a.m. on Friday morning. I saw him from my shop across the street. He was at the bank door in the act of sweeping out the hall. I have known the deceased for about 5 years. On Thursday I saw him and he looked like a man in great grief. His face was swollen and very red. Mark Scottlip, a painter, deposed, I saw the body lying on the floor and called attention to it. Mr. Moore at once said that it was Mr. Farrier. I know very well that the deceased was a sober man. The deceased was lying on his stomach with his legs spread out. As he lay, his shoulder was close to the leg of the bedstead. His coat and vest were off, and it appears that he must have fallen forward while in the act of making the bed. There was an empty tumbler on the mantel shelf, but it had no smell. There were no indications of poison or a struggle. The deceased watch was on the chimney piece, wound up and showing the correct time. Senior Constable Cook deposed that on the morning of the Friday he first heard of the death of the deceased. He proceeded to the bank and made a minute examination of the place. There were no appearances of a struggle nor any marks of violence on the body. It appeared to him the deceased had fallen down and died suddenly. In the pockets of the deceased was found a purse containing £1, 1 shilling and 9 pence in money and a couple of worn gold rings and a certificate for the burial of his child. The watch and the chain produced with the above-mentioned articles was pointed out to him on the chimney piece by Mr. Boyd as the property of the deceased. There was no suspicion that the deceased had come to his death by anything but natural means. Dr. Gummo deposed that the day before his death the deceased consulted him, but he did not anticipate any serious consequences. The general appearance of the man was shattered, and he complained much of his debility and want of rest. He had little or no appetite. He saw the deceased again the same morning when he called for a certificate for his wife's burial, and he appeared very low. On Friday morning he was called to the Bank of Victoria about 11:30, where he found the body of the deceased still warm and limbs still flexible. He might have been dead 1 hour. There was no smell of opium or any indication of poison in the room. There were no marks of violence on the body. There was no protrusion of the tongue or froth in the mouth, and the pupil of the eye was natural. He attributed death to exhaustion and the immediate cause being failure of the heart's action. When he last saw the deceased alive, his pulse was very feeble and he advised stimulants, but it did not appear that the deceased had taken any. There was no suspicion in his mind of suicide or death from anything but natural causes. There was, in his opinion, no occasion for a post-mortem examination. The deceased, he should imagine, was a man bordering on 60 years of age. So the coroner briefly summoned up and the jury returned a verdict of death from natural causes. And in another article it was mentioned that Samuel E. Farrier was a respectable, industrious man. The deceased was a man tolerably advanced in years, but the day before that he was last seen alive, he sustained severe domestic bereavements and the loss of his wife and his infant child too, having in the same week also died. It can easily be understood by those who knew the man that, worn out by watching and the anxiety and broken-heartedness of the poor fellow, was a very slender thread held him to existence. The deceased leaves 2 little girls, 6 and 8 years of age, dependent upon the tender mercies of the public or the state. The orphans are at present, having been for some days past, in the care of Reverend J. Garlick, who all through have been most assiduous in his attentions to the afflicted family. Today at 2:30 the remains will be conveyed to the Bridge Hotel to their last resting place in the cemetery. Thus child, mother and father will have, on successive days, been followed to the grave. And 4 days later it mentions the Farrier orphans. A meeting will be held at the Church of England parsonage on Thursday evening at 8 o'clock, to which the attendance of persons interesting themselves in the disposal of the orphan children of the late Samuel and Mary Farrier are invited. By the 29th of November, the goods of the late Samuel E. Farrier were auctioned for the benefit of the family. So the residence was auctioned, as well as household furniture and effects, a sewing machine, a boat, goats and fowls. So all of the cash was going to be given to the children. And so my assumption is that James and his wife quite possibly attended this meeting. And even though Annie was sent to the orphanage November 1873, it stated that she was adopted by Mary and John in 1874. and they did go and collect her from the asylum. So it's quite possible maybe once the Echuca residents found out that her sister had died, that they felt that they could help out and adopt her. And the other family member to mention is James's sister. He had only one family member emigrate to Australia, and his sister Elizabeth Ann Merton, she was born on the 27th of May 1844 in Constantine, Cornwall, England, and she arrived in Melbourne on the Maori, aged 19, on the 26th of June 1863. She married Robert Duncan Peachy in Victoria on the 29th of April 1869. They had 9 children, and in 1897 Robert is referred to as Esquire, and they lived at a home called Lindale in Parkville, Victoria in 1907, and then they lived in a property called Rosal in Caulfield in 1920. Elizabeth died in Caulfield on the 12th of December 1924, aged 80, 6 months after her husband. So there you have it, a story about a riverboat snagging operator, Captain James Hill.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.